Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first session of the Northwest eLearn Summer Online Series. What you are seeing on the screen right now are some poll questions for you. So please just take a moment to answer these questions. And while you're doing that, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Oregon State University College of Education and eCampus for their sponsorship of our summer online events. We hope that these summer offerings will help our community better prepare for the fall. One thing I do want to note here is that we don't have closed captioning for the live events, but we will add closed captioning in post-production. Okay, without further ado, I am excited to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Sheryl Burgstahler. Sheryl is an affiliate professor in the College of Education at the University of Washington, and she also founded and directs the Do IT Center and Accessible Technology Services at UW. If you have any questions during Sheryl's presentation, feel free to ask in the Q&A area. You should see the button at the bottom of your webinar screen. We have Anna and Emily from the board today to help monitor the questions so that Sheryl could address them at the end. Now I'm going to close the poll. And I'm turning the mic to Sheryl.
Well, here we are. Looking forward to looking at these poll results here. Not too many surprises, but it's always good to know the diversity in an audience. Most of you, not surprisingly, have taught an online course, a fully online course, and similarly for partially online. Have you assisted in the design of an online course? I'm looking down to that one right now and most of you have, which is also not a surprise with this group. Have you converted or developed, helped develop a course to online, moving it from on-site to online? And most of you have done that as well. On this day, we're doing a lot of that all over the place. And have you employed accessible design strategies for online content? Some there too, higher than I expected, 79%, that's great. And have you been an administrator in an online program? And there are 40% of you who have been administrators. So there's a lot of variety, lots of experience, and that would be expected. This presentation is designed to reach a wide variety of audiences. And so some of you will find much of the content familiar, but maybe you'll come up with some ideas on how to share accessible practices with other people, like reluctant faculty members. There are many of them reluctant to teach online, and to make them accessible as well when they do teach online. Some pointers to some technical expertise. So today we see this new normal of protests and hand sanitizers and social distancing and facial masks. And sometimes it's difficult, at least for me, to figure out what I can do for myself and my family to have a balanced life in this situation, but also looking for ways that I and others can contribute to the greater good. Sometimes the negative news makes you feel like there's nothing we can do. We're just helpless. And with so much uncertainty, one thing that we can do is make sure that what we're doing is more inclusive of other people. And all of us in this group today deal with online learning in one way or another. And how can we make sure that whatever we're creating, that it benefits not just the average students or the above average students, but everyone, and includes people like people who are instructors who also have disabilities. So the idea is not to leave anybody out. So I'm going to talk about the basic design of online and remote learning for everyone, not getting into a lot of technical details, kind of covering the framework that you as a designer and instructor could look at and say, this is my framework. This is how I feel about providing design. And here was where I can get the resources to learn exactly how I can caption a video and so forth. So moving along here. So what do I mean by an inclusive course? A lot of people mean different things by this, and sometimes inclusion means things like just people being included because they are now able to take a course at a distance. I'm out at Hood Canal right now at a little beach house that we have out here, and so I'm distant from my office and my university, but I can be included in this event today. So by inclusive, I mean everyone that meets the requirements with or without accommodations is encouraged to participate. And everyone feels welcome once they get in there. And if you have to make a whole bunch of accommodations just for a student to get access to the syllabus, I can be sure that that person does not feel very welcome in your course. At least they don't feel like you've anticipated that they might be in the course. And people are able to be fully engaged in accessible and inclusive activities. Not everything can be made fully accessible, as many of you know, but we can certainly do a better job of making things more accessible. So why do we include groups of people? I don't know. It just seems like a silly thing that we as humans have to find ways to include people in so many different situations. We certainly have examples of that today. But I'm going to share my kind of a lighthearted example, but it happened a long time ago, in my quest to become a patrol boy. Now, I grew up in an age in the 50s where patrol boys were patrol boys. But when I was just finishing 5th grade, going into 6th grade, I realized that 6th graders could be patrol boys, and I wanted that job, and I knew I could do that job. And so I signed up as I was supposed to, and the organizer said, well, it's for boys. Girls can't be patrol boys. I grew up with a lot of experiences working with guys, with my male cousins, and my dad had to use car lot, so we had a lot of people in the shop, and they were all men, and so that didn't bother me. I told him I could do the job, made my case, and he says, well, no. And so he pointed me to the principal saying he would maybe make an exception. But anyway, I went down to the principal's office, and I had my case made, and I said, I want to be a patrol boy. And anyway, he came back with all sorts of different arguments. At the end, he said, well, you can't be a patrol boy because you're not strong enough. And I thought, as I walked down the hall back to my classroom, I thought, wow, that's a kind of a silly answer. I was trying to figure out what strength you needed to be to hold that little flag and to put it across so that people could walk across the street. And so I gained from that experience that even people in positions of power could make bad decisions. I wasn't that discouraged because I knew that he had made the bad decision. But this isn't the end of the story. There were a lot of little girls probably like me that wanted to be patrol boys back then. And there's an end to this story that actually has a point to it that related to this talk. I'll get to that at the end of the talk, so don't leave early. You'll miss it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about history of why we treat underrepresented groups, accommodations and universal design, 3 sets of principles. Some of you may be familiar with the principles of universal design for learning. I'm going to share 2 others. To kind of finish the package, I think, for underpinning the design of accessible online learning. Examples of a few practices and some broad issues related to the delivery of inclusive practices in online learning. Like, where are we going to go from here? What do we need from researchers? What do we need from designers and so forth? And then I'll point you to some resources at the end. I will point you to a book. It has 40 different authors in it about universal design in higher education. Printed by Harvard Education Press. And there's going to be a follow-on book. If you're familiar with this one, you might be interested, or otherwise, on inclusive learning opportunities in higher education, a universal design toolkit. And this one follows on that book. It's not a new edition of that book, but has a lot of real practical guidelines, and a lot of them have to do with online issues, including online learning, but also online student services, and so forth. My email is Sheryl B, SHERYLB @uw.edu. And you can email any questions after the presentation is over. I can point you to other resources, particularly if you want more technical expertise that we're not going to cover today. I can tell you the best places to look. And this will also, if you send email to me, you can join our Universal Design in Higher Education online community of practice. It's an international group that talks about how we can apply universal design in all that we do. Well, I'm going to just give you a little 1-minute history lesson on the evolution of responses to human differences. I like to present this to faculty because sometimes they will take the attitude that, well, why is this a new thing here? Why now? You know, do we have to do this accessible design and so forth? And so I like to share, well, where have we come from in this regard? There are many cases in history of people of underrepresented groups being eliminated, unfortunately, and some of that even happens today in some places, but certainly excluded often. even well-meaning people that excluded their children from school, and that the teachers were just fine with that as well, for what they considered to be good reasons, so they wouldn't be bullied and so forth. Then we moved, well, maybe we shouldn't exclude them like children in school, so let's segregate them. They really have special needs, students with disabilities, and so we'll just put them in a special classroom and we'll give them special training, and that will be the best for them. And then the middle of the last century, in part motivated by World War II, when men returned from the war, and they were able to come back from the war, and they had disabilities, and there were a lot of conditions that we needed to work with, and we certainly weren't going to leave them out of post-secondary education and other opportunities. So we focused then on a cure. How can we fix some of these conditions that people have that may be labeled disabilities? And along with that, how can we rehabilitate that individual so that they can be better equipped to deal with a world that isn't very accessible to them? And then that was clear that we couldn't solve all the problems that way. And so that leads to accommodations or adjustments. So a person with a disability, like someone returning from World War II with several disabilities, could go to campus. They have the GI Bill, and so their tuition was paid for. So they were welcomed on campus at Heroes, and because they had full funding. And so then, well, how can we accommodate them? How can we make this course work for them, even though it wasn't developed in the beginning to be accessible to them? And then the civil rights movement for women and minorities had a big impact on the disability community. And so they too were looking for social justice. And if we look at social justice, that people with disabilities just have a right to be doing things like everyone else, that leads us to a couple of different approaches beyond accommodation. That leads to inclusion, like if they have a right to go to college to be in an online course, shouldn't we include them fully like other students? And then universal design, which is a broader concept on making sure that something is created from the beginning to be inclusive, to be accessible to other people. So what is the basis for access? And this is one thing that I like to emphasize with faculty, but gloss over it very quickly, because it isn't the main reason we should make things accessible, but it is important to know that we have a legal basis for this going back to 1973. People like to point out to me, well, we didn't have an internet back then. Well, it's civil rights legislation. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 says whatever we're doing, and however we're doing it, we need to be inclusive of people with disabilities. And later, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and its 2008 amendments, much more commonly known, similar wording as 504, but reinforces this idea that if we're offering something, a service, a course, whatever, it needs to be accessible to people with disabilities. To put some teeth into this, there are hundreds now of universities and colleges that have received civil rights complaints through the Office of Civil Rights or the Department of Justice about the inaccessibility of their IT, often particularly pointing to online learning. And these colleges and universities have had to reach a resolution with the federal government to correct these situations. And often in those resolutions, they've had to make their online learning accessible, including their documents like PDFs and their videos being captioned and audio described and so forth. So there's a good reason, if you want to look at it from a legal standpoint, to actually make your courses accessible from the beginning, whether you're a designer or you're a faculty member. So what does accessible really mean? One thing that happened in these resolutions is a definition emerged that's used in pretty much all of them about what we mean, what our federal government means anyway, by IT accessibility. And so what it says is that accessible means a person with a disability is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. I think you could just stop there. It seems clear to me, but it really wants to emphasize the major points here by saying the person with a disability must be able to obtain the information as fully, equally, and independently as a person without a disability. So that is our goal. That's our goal in our courses, to make the IT within those courses and more generally the instructional approaches accessible. And this is what we mean by that in our country. There are a lot of online learning headlines these days, and I just Googled this yesterday, and I was thinking, what are we talking about as far as online learning, and particularly with dealing with accessibility? You see a lot of negative headlines. Failure in the virtual classroom. The results are in for remote learning. It didn't work. Students and teachers flunked remote learning, teaching and learning after COVID-19. And so a lot of things related to online learning and the pandemic. What I didn't see in these articles, even the ones that were more positive, is talk about making those courses inclusive of people with disabilities. Often low-income students were mentioned, sometimes racial ethnic minorities, but not students with disabilities. And so one thing that we can do as a group here who care about accessible design is take some steps where we have control in assuring that online courses are accessible to students with disabilities. I hear horror stories, anecdotal, especially in the K-12 community, about students with disabilities not being served at all, basically, once all the courses went online. And some of the parents haven't been as vocal as they probably should have because they didn't even really know what was possible. And the teachers that were asked to teach online didn't know how to do it, how to make it accessible. So when we're looking at accessibility, though, I like to look rather than at definitions of disability, but look at ability on a continuum, from all the way from not able to very able. So the ability to understand English, social norms, could be very able. Looking at the left-hand side of the double-edged arrow would be not able to understand English or social norms. Could be because of a disability or English as a second language or cultural issues from the past or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It just is important for us as instructors and designers to know that people in our courses will have various capabilities in this area. I do this in an online class I'm teaching. I often use the word low-hanging fruit because it's about accessible design of just about everything on post-secondary campuses using universal design. And I like to use the word expression low-hanging fruit. And just a simple thing to do is the first time I use it, I mentioned for those of you not familiar with that expression, what I mean by it is. And so often we're thrown slogans and jargon and so forth our way, acronyms, and they're not explained. And we might think, well, everybody knows that. Well, maybe not everybody. And if you universally design your course, you just automatically include that explanation. You don't wait for somebody to ask you. So the ability to see or hear or walk or read print, to write with a pen or pencil, to communicate verbally, to tune out distraction, to learn, to manage one's physical and mental health. We're all somewhere on this continuum, and likely in our lifetime, we're moving one way or the other. Another thing about disabilities to remember and to share with faculty is that most disabilities are invisible. And so some faculty in on-site courses, for instance, will tell me, well, I don't have any students with disabilities in my class. And I always, well, how do you know that? So I don't see any. Well, you can't see disabilities. Most disabilities you can't see. And so that's something for faculty to know. They've probably had a lot of students with disabilities in their classes, on-site or otherwise, that they never knew about. Fewer than 1/3 of the students who have disabilities report them to the Disability Services Office. Maybe they think they don't need an accommodation. Maybe they're feeling that they might be discriminated against if they disclose that they have a certain type of disability. And so we can't count on the Disability Services Office to let us know that someone with a disability is in our class. And disability services on our campuses are primarily focused on accommodations. And this would be accommodations to students after inaccessibility is discovered and that student has actually declared their disability and asked for accommodations. And so they're always an after the fact option. Now, not to say that disability services offices haven't embraced universal design, and some of them are the leading advocates. It's just not the traditional primary role of that office, which is based on civil rights legislation that requires that we provide accommodations and other adjustments for students with disabilities in our schools. So if we look at an online course, the two that are very expensive in terms of time and effort are creating accessible documents, mainly reformatting PDF files by far. On our campus, that's what we tend to do in our Disability Services Office, and we help with that, so we know a lot of that is taking place. And the second one is captioning videos. And often these are YouTube videos that just need to have those captions that are created automatically by a computer, edited to make them appropriate for a student who's deaf. So I'd like to define universal design before we go on here so that we have an understanding. This is similar to that IT accessibility definition I put up. IT accessibility definition is related to IT, first of all, and very much related to disability, where universal design is related to everything, every application, and it's related to any type of difference. It's not just about disability. The design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So the idea in an online course would be that we'd be able to offer that course and have a minimum number of accommodations for students with disabilities. Often faculty will tell me, well, I don't mind giving accommodations. Well, how would you like to take class and have to have all these special things considered when that faculty member could have just made it accessible to everybody? And so that's why. Also, it can be very slow getting the accommodations, so our students who need remediating PDFs, for instance, may not get their syllabus until way after the other students have it. So if we look at the universal design of online learning, we just add a couple of words here. The design of online learning products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. You could put students in there instead of people as well, but I like leaving people there because it could be the instructor that actually has the disability. So in a nutshell, universal design is any design that is accessible to people with disabilities, like that IT accessibility definition. It's inclusive, so everyone is using the same product or adjustments to or options in a particular product as much as possible, and it's usable. Usable is a higher level than accessible in my mind because it requires that you not only have access to it, but you can actually functionally use it. We have a person on our staff, Hadi, who is blind himself and was reporting to me not long ago about a software package that required that he memorize 100 or have access to 100 shortcut keys in order to use all the functions of a piece of software. He could do everything technically by running through all those hoops, but it's not very usable. You know, I don't think most of us would accept that that's what you'd have to do to run a simple software package. So what we need on most of our campuses and online programs is a paradigm shift from an accommodation focused to a universal design focused online learning. And if that's in higher education, that would be UDHE, Universal Design in Higher Education. So I have two images here, and one has a large circle inside of UDHE with accommodations, and the second one has a smaller one. If we really embrace universal design, we're over on the right-hand circle where accommodations are just a smaller proportion of what we do, but they're included in universal design. We still will provide accommodations. On the left-hand side, we have a greater portion of the circle is in accommodation. So most of the access we're giving students with disabilities in that image is through accommodations, not through other universal design strategies. Universal design is not new. In 1970, we had a young man, quadriplegic at the University of Washington, who appeared on the daily front page with the sign that said, "Ramp the curbs, keep me off the street." And so he was lobbying for curb cuts. And of course, today, we all have accepted curb cuts as a very valuable feature in our sidewalks and use them mostly by people without disabilities, pushing baby strollers and so forth. And so an accessible feature, and this one, universal design feature, can benefit everybody. I'd also like to point out the difference between an inclusive and usable design, or accessible and universal design, and an inclusive design. The typical entrance to a building, like I've shown here, has a couple of steps and then a ramp to the side for wheelchair users and other people who might have mobility impairments. This is typical. It is ADA compliant. It is quite usable, but it is not inclusive. Because two people, let's say someone walking next to someone using a wheelchair, will enter the building in two different ways. I've actually gone up the ramp in front of a person or behind them who's using a wheelchair, and that's very awkward, so I don't recommend that. So I go off on the right-hand side. Since I don't use a wheelchair, I go up the steps, they go up the ramp, we meet at the top. It's accessible, it's usable, allows people to do things. But an inclusive ramp would be in an entrance to a building, would be like another building on campus where we have a very slight sloped ramp going into a building, and it's quite wide. And in this case, everyone can use the same entrance, and they can walk side by side into that building. The stairs are available. If you want to use stairs, you can, but they're not the primary way that you access the facility. So in online learning, this means the primary documents you use and the videos and the resources that you create should be accessible to everybody. They all use the same product. Beneficiaries of technology are a wide variety of people when you're applying universal design. It's not just about people with disabilities. So a video, for instance, properly captioned, is accessible to someone who can't hear the audio, but also English language learners, people in a noisy environment, like an airport, people in a noiseless environment, like a baby's room when they're sleeping, people who have a slow internet connection. Can benefit people who want to know the spelling of words. So certainly in instruction, students want to know the spelling of words. And people who need to find content quickly. If your captions are text-based, there's a way to search those captions to find particular content. And so universally designed IT and other things benefit everyone. And as far as the universal design of IT, there are actually two things to consider. One is that it builds in accessibility features like our iPhones and other smartphones and devices where we can change the foreground and background. It will talk to us. My computer and my phone seem to talk to me more than I'd like these days. And it ensures compatibility with assistive technology. And so assistive technology is this specialized technology that people with disabilities might be using. So a person taking your class might be someone like Nicole, who is image of Nicole here, who is totally blind. And she actually works for Google now, but she uses screen reader software that with a speech synthesizer that reads the text that's presented to her aloud. It doesn't do so well with images, but it does very well with text to give her that particular content. She does have a Braille printer and embosser, which is assistive technology. And we wouldn't think of building that into an iPhone or whatever, but what's important is that her technology that she's using, the mainstream technology, is compatible with that assistive technology. Jessie has multiple learning disabilities, and last I checked, she's working at Amazon, and she uses speech output for one of her learning disabilities and speech input. She dictates content for another one of her disabilities. And so may seem like cognitive overhead to some of us, but it works really well for her and allows her to get material into a document or email or whatever, but also read it back to her so she can do further edits and read email and other things. Anthony has physical disabilities, and he cannot use a standard keyboard. And so he has a device, a flat screen keyboard that he has on his computer, on his strapped to his wheelchair, and accesses his computer this way as well. And he can point to various keys on his device, but he doesn't have fine motor skills, and so he has to use software that will translate what he's entering into input that the computer will understand. He also uses environmental control software and hardware because he does live independently. He can't use his voice, and so he uses his computer interfaced with a phone to operate his telephone. And he actually provides phone support for assistive technology, talks to a lot of parents of newly diagnosed children with disabilities similar to his about how they can use technology to be more successful in school and socially and all sorts of life experiences. So people like this might be in your class. And so the idea of universal design, if you're training faculty, would be to say, just imagine that they're there. You don't have to survey to find out if they're there. Just imagine these people are in your class. And in this presentation today, for instance, I am imagining that someone at this presentation cannot see the screen. I don't know why, but they can't. And so I just make sure I describe enough of the screen, the images and so forth, that they gain the content. and can follow along. So you don't need to know about the thousands and thousands of assistive technologies that are available for people with disabilities. Most of us that are designing software and online courses and so forth need to know what that technology, the assistive technology, can do. What are its capabilities and what are its limitations? And so here are a few key ones for us to be thinking about. The assistive technology someone might be using is able to emulate the keyboard, but not the mouse. In this case, Anthony would be in that category. So we need to make sure, because Anthony can access all the keyboard commands, that when we design a website or software, that it can be operable with the keyboard alone. You don't need to know the details about Anthony's device. You just need to know he probably can't use a mouse. And so if you're doing pulling down menus, pull down menus on a website, if you're creating them, just making sure that people can get the access to all of those functions by using a keyboard, including the arrow keys to move around the screen. So that's good to know. Cannot read content presented in images. I mentioned that in the case of Nicole. So she can access all the text, but not the images. There's some artificial intelligence now that's doing a pretty good job at describing some images, by the way, but it's not something that is perfectly accurate either. So what we need to do as designers is provide alternative text. Whenever we post an image in a class content page, that we provide alternative text, and most learning management systems now will remind you to do that, and sometimes they even tell you why. A screen reader can tab from link to link and from heading to heading. And so someone using a screen reader, that could be Nicole or Hadi on my staff, he may want to look at a website or a content page in an online learning class, and he might want to skip from link to link just to see what that page links to. If all of your links are nicely organized by using the same wording, like click here, click here, click here, then the only option he has, or Nicole would have, would be to go back and read the whole page to get the surrounding text around that link to figure out where it goes. Unless he wants to just link to something that is unknown and then just wander around and figure out what it is. Similarly, so you want to include descriptive wording on your link. So you want to say, do it website, Northwest eLearn conference, and so forth, on the link text itself. And another thing that a screen reader can do is it can skip from heading to heading. This too can help Hadi and Nicole find out the organization of a long document. Maybe it's a 20-page document and they want to know what the basic subheadings are. If you just format those headings by bolding the text, that isn't enough. You need to do the style function in Word, for example, and other features within PDFs and within web pages and so forth, to structure those headings in a hierarchical way. And so then Hadi or Nicole could skip from heading to heading using their screen reader, and it would say heading 1, heading 3, and the title of those headings, and so they'd see the organization of the paper. And then I already mentioned that functions like YouTube and other tools cannot accurately transcribe audio. And so people who use YouTube and other software packages like that, other tools, need to go back and simply edit those captions and to make them accurate. Most people apparently don't know you can do that, or they just find the humor in all those YouTube videos when they have the silly captions on them. But you can put the punctuation in and so forth. It's not a hard thing to do. And then if there's just an audio file, to provide a transcription of that audio. So I had the distinction of teaching the first online course at the University of Washington. This was back in 1995. I was a young teenager, I think at the time. I was quite young. And so I and Dr. Norm Coombs at the Rochester Institute of Technology taught this class. And I had 2 questions. It was in the early days. There was no World Wide Web. I had one question was, could you possibly offer an online course that would be even close to what you can do on site? That's the educator part of me. And then there was the IT accessibility part of me. Could you make that accessible to students with disabilities without requiring them to have accommodations? So he and I, who had taught on site a lot, Norm happens to be blind himself, decided we were going to create this accessible class called Adaptive Technology for People with Disabilities, and the University of Washington agreed to offer it. So the technology we used was email, basic email, much like we're using today, not as many options, but it was there. A discussion list, a Gopher server, which was a little outline format created by University of Minnesota, of course, to access content, certainly not as capable as the internet pages that we have today. Telnet, which allowed you to log on to NASA and other big computer systems, and then file transfer protocol to move files around, images around, and so forth. We had everything in a text format, which was easy to do back then. There wasn't much graphic information except the files you were moving around. And then we used postal mail. We mailed publications. We mailed captioned and audio described VHS, remember those? Videos. It was in the early day of the Do It program that I direct, and all of our videos were captioned and audio described at that time. And so that's what we did. And the point I'm making here is all the basic principles I'm going to be talking about today applied back then. The tools were different, the times were different, but the basic concepts are the same. And I see a group of 3 sets of principles that can underpin everything we did back then, but also what we're doing today in online learning. And those principles are universal design for learning, and the principles that underpin the web content accessibility guidelines. I think only using one can cause you to maybe not do some things you do otherwise. For instance, in universal design for learning, we will look for options for presenting information, and sometimes people applying that will say, well, I've got the video, and then I'm just going to provide a document and not caption the video. Where universal design would, more generally would say, no, each of those things should be made accessible. You shouldn't have 2 inaccessible things that you call then enough. So principles of universal design, just quickly, these are quite old. I mean, they've been around a long time, and they initially were applied to the physical environment and to products like items that you might use in a kitchen. But the basic principles also laid the foundation for the universal design of IT. And so, but the basic principles are things like equitable use, that everyone should be able to use whatever you're doing. Flexibility in use, you can do things in different ways. Things are simple and intuitive. You can perceive the information. Everybody can perceive the information, whether they can see the screen or not, for instance. That there's a good tolerance for error. And so if I make a mistake, it counsels me on how I can get back on track. Low physical effort, unless you're teaching muscle building or something. Size and space for approach and use, which is particularly useful in a computer lab, for example. So here's our basic foundation to look to. And there are a lot of practices that have been developed through the universal design framework. And that framework was in the early days used for the universal design of online learning. But now we have 2 others that we can point to that are helpful as well. The first one is universal design for learning. Many of you have heard about that, where we offer multiple means of representation, multiple means of engagement, and multiple means of action and expression. So we offer multiple means for doing things in our courses. The third one are the principles of universal design for IT. And those are the principles that underpin the web content accessibility guidelines, which many of our campuses use and are widely noted in the resolutions with campuses as far as making their courses and other IT accessible. The web content accessibility guidelines, they've been around for quite some time, and they provide guidance even for IT that isn't actually a web page or something like videos and so forth. But you can see how it overlaps with universal design and even universal design for learning, and that everything should be perceivable by everyone. They should be able to see, gain access to that content. So if you hide content within an image, for example, a person who's blind cannot see that image, and their screen reader can't read the content in it because it's an image, then it's not perceivable to them unless we provide alternative text. Should be operable, should be able to use it. Understandable and robust, meaning I can operate my courses and so forth on various web browsers. We know that's not always the case, but a robust course would be able to be used with various web browsers. So as far as the final product here, when we show ways that we can allow a student to show their knowledge in a course, it's important to remember that if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. I think this applies so well to universal design. It's easy to brush off. A student didn't do well at this. And so, well, I guess they didn't prepare enough. I guess they didn't do something right. Where universal design would say, well, let's look first to the product and say, how could I have done that better? It doesn't mean that students don't have to do their part, but it does mean that we on the other end should do our part as well. And this quote was from Albert Einstein, so he was a pretty smart guy. So some of you have seen this before, and I'm not going to go through this whole list, but I'm going to point to the URL, a product that we created in a project called Access Cyber Learning, a list of 20 tips for guidance for an online instructor. And one of the things that this checklist took into account is so few people, more now, but so few people were applying any accessibility practices in their courses. So how could we put together a relatively short list to get them started and not overwhelm them with all the details about the redesign of a PDF that's inaccessible? So it's up on the web. I'll list the URL for those that can't see it. uwit/DOIT/20-tips-teaching-accessible-online-course. And these will be available in the version that you can have access to after the presentation. So I found that there were about half and half of these guidelines were about the documents and the images and the web pages and the videos and so forth, the technology, and about the other half were just simple, basic instructional methods that are good teaching methods for everyone. In the document itself, each one of these points to different references that can help with the details. So my first guideline is to avoid PDFs. Now, if you're an expert on PDFs and making them accessible and you really love PDFs, well, that's fine. PDFs are more difficult than other things to make accessible, and many of the PDFs out on the internet are scanned in and not accessible to people who are blind. I don't use any PDFs in my courses. I do like to have I hardly ever use a separate document like a Word document or PDF or PowerPoint or anything in my online courses that are all asynchronous. But I don't use PDFs, but I do use an attached document only for the syllabus because the syllabus is something a student might want to print out. And I also want them to be able to edit it to tailor the syllabus for their needs, adding more details about the schedule and so forth, and their assignments, notes to themselves, taking out things that don't apply to them. But I use Word because Word is a much easier format to make accessible. But even that I use as a secondary source of the syllabus. The syllabus is in the content pages in accessible format in the learning management system. But then I have an attachment in Microsoft Word that is an accessible version that they could print out or edit, and I encourage them to do that. We talked about structuring headings and providing descriptive text for images, for both hyperlinks, but also for other images. We talked about, well, we didn't talk about this way, but we're using large, bold fonts, uncluttered pages, plain backgrounds, particularly if you are using PDFs like I am today, PowerPoints as I am today. So this is an example of that. Not very fussy PDFs, pretty easy to see, and high contrast between the foreground and background. And then, of course, captioning videos. Depending on how you make them, that's where you have to go to that source to see how you caption them. But you can pretty much caption anything. And there are actually some tools that allow you to caption videos that you didn't even actually create yourself. So using accessible tools is another one. Sometimes that's hard to determine. You might need your IT accessibility staff to help you with that. I will say in helping online learning instructors, though, that especially people that are early in getting started in online learning, they tend to use way too many different tools. And it doesn't have anything to do with the accessibility of those tools for people with disabilities, although that's a factor as well, don't get me wrong, but it's that you're asking students to do all these different things. In other words, they're focusing on this technology they're using and the process rather than on what they're supposed to be learning. So always take a look at a tool, and if you can, use a simpler tool, but also minimize the number of tools you're using. If you use tools within a standard learning management system like Canvas and Blackboard and so forth, you could assume that efforts have been made to make those tools accessible. There's usually more problem when you go out to find other tools that you want to draw in or send your students to a website to do things, and you might run into accessibility issues. If you can't make a tool, use an accessible tool, it's actually very good for you to know that, because at least you'll know how to work with the Disability Services Office to provide an alternative for a student who can't use that tool. Then looking at instructional methods, I'll just list a couple of them, but things like providing options for communicating, using asynchronous methods, making instructions and expectations clear, addressing a wide range of technical skills, providing options for learning, providing options for demonstrating learning, spelling out acronyms, defining jargon, and so forth. Notice that the 3 providing options items are listed a little different than UDL. I use those 3 because I find that for faculty not real familiar with UDL can find the 3 a little bit confusing, but they don't when you use these. It's like, what options are you providing for communicating? What options are you providing for learning things? And what options are you providing for demonstrating that students have learned certain things? And so options, options, options is the game. And if you look at a syllabus, looking at the content a little bit, one thing I recommend is including 2 statements regarding accessibility. One is, of course, the disability focused one provided by your institution or your organization, include that. But I encourage you to include another statement, and this is a personal statement on your philosophy of teaching or inclusion. So mine, I can share it with you if you want to send me an email, but it's something along the lines of, it's my goal in my class to make everything that I do welcoming and accessible to everyone in my class. If you find some of the techniques I'm using or the products I'm using not accessible to you, please let me know. And I'll see, and we'll talk about that or whatever. But anyway, it's they can talk to me, because so many of the statements from your Disability Services Office just basically say, go there. And think of the message you're sending your student. I include the first one because I want it to be welcoming and want them to know I'm involved in working with them. If you just send them the accommodation message, doesn't it send them the message, oh, you have a disability, oh, go over there. You have to go talk to those people. I don't know anything about this. So make sure your syllabus is welcoming and includes instructor information, some information to make them feel approachable. But also, as far as the communication with the faculty, include ways students can interact with you. In my syllabus, I say, you can meet with me one-on-one, just make an appointment for us to meet, a good time for you to meet. We can meet by email, with the discussion board in our learning management system. We can use Zoom and so forth. I list some things, but then I make it clear that that they can choose that. Choose which method you'd like to use to communicate with me. I like to use Zoom, but that's about me. And when I'm talking to my students, it's about them and what do they want to do as far as communicating with me. Making sure that that your syllabus is in an accessible format, it's logically organized, includes a target audience. This is a good one too, including what technical skills you expect. What do you expect them to know? Learning objectives and details about the readings and assignments. As much detail as you can provide, or link to it fairly quickly in your syllabus so people can plan ahead. So you can often take a challenge you are personally having in the course, and you can find an accessibility solution, a universal design solution that can help you deal with that issue. And so you can kind of think in a universal design way. In fact, I expect students should have a good writing skill before they take my class, but each term, a few of them do not. Some students, faculty wrestle with this because they think, gee, I don't want to spend the time in class to teach them. I assign a paper to my students, but I give them a very good resource, one that I specifically picked for them to help them write that paper, and I will give them a format for doing so. And I also do that as far as technical skills. Assume that someone in your Canvas class, for instance, it's the first time they've used Canvas. point them to the best video and best resource for getting started in Canvas, rather than just initially that big page with all those different resources. Another one is giving assignments out. Can you make your assignment accessible? I have one assignment where students have to search the internet for an image of something. It happens to be universal design. Well, immediately I know, because I think in terms of universal design, a blind student can't do that. And maybe somebody with a low internet quality can't do it very well either. So I write in the assignment, say, either choose an image online that you find and they have to report on it, whatever, or describe an environment you are in that represents this universal design feature I'm talking about. And so the design of the assignment itself is made accessible. So in summary, universal design, it's an attitude, a framework, a goal, a process, values diversity, equity, and inclusion, promotes best practices, does not lower standards, is proactive, can be implemented incrementally, benefits everyone, and minimizes the need for accommodations. So that framework is a good one to employ and teach about. I mentioned our Access Cyber Learning project, and there's a URL on here for a report that we wrote on accessible cyber learning, a community report of the current state and recommendations for the future. And you can search for cyber learning on our Do It website at uw.edu to find that report. It's a very interesting one to talk about the future of online learning and other digital learning. But some of the issues that are in there are certainly pertinent to online learning today. How do we increase the knowledge and skills of stakeholders, particularly faculty, my target group, but also IT folks and so forth, and get them to adopt a universal design approach system-wide? How can they integrate universal design in the design of the IT that's used in online learning? Cyber learning projects around the country are being funded by the National Science Foundation right now, hundreds of them. And they do not require, NSF does not require that the tools that are being developed by the designers in those projects are accessible to students with disabilities. We are working on that problem. But for NSF not to require accessibility in the research that they're funding is unimaginable in my mind, why they still do that. And then increasing the capabilities of assistive technology. My basic question is, why with artificial intelligence do we as designers have to know about alternative text or the text that we provide in images, but also the being able to look at a PDF document and see that there are certain headings and subheadings? Why can't AI look at that and see, regardless of how we create it, say, oh, that must be the heading 1 and that must be heading 2? Why can't artificial intelligence do that work for us and make it easier for us to create accessible PDFs? Now, I promised you I'd tell the end of the story. What you can learn from my quest to be a patrol boy. I did try to be a patrol boy at the end of 5th grade, was unsuccessful. I told my son, Travis, about this situation when he became a crossing guard at school. And he was just surprised that girls couldn't be crossing guards, because of course they could. You know, he didn't really understand it. I wasn't sure he was even listening to me. But the end of the story is that when he went to summer camp or spring camp with his class, he said, Mom, I have to go to camp this week and I have to find a replacement. And so I actually became a patrol boy or crossing guard many more years after I initially wanted to be that guard. And here I am actually in that role. I've got a picture of me right up here on the screen with the uniform, which is even better than I would have had when I was in elementary school. I guess the point I'm making here is sometimes it takes a long time, maybe just a new generation to make these accessibility things, in our case, happen. But I'm hoping my grandchildren, I'll be able to tell them about some inaccessible IT things, and they're going to say, really? They didn't make IT accessible to people with disabilities when you were younger? They won't say I'm young, but when I was younger. And they'll just be kind of surprised by that. And that is, after all, what we're all looking for, what we hope to get to at that point. There are some resources on the PowerPoint that you can access after the presentation. And I'm ready for questions and answers.
Thank you, Sheryl. You've provided some really good information and helpful resources. We do have some questions here for you. Anna, would you like to read the questions so Sheryl could answer?
Yes, of course. So one of the questions we had was, do you find Blackboard Ally a valuable tool for faculty to use in making instructional materials accessible?
Yes. Ally is a Blackboard product, but it can be interfaced with Canvas and Blackboard, of course. And it's a tool that gives, almost in a game sort of format, tells faculty how well they're doing on accessibility, and gives them some hints on making things more accessible, like caption videos and PDFs and so forth. It also provides a tool where students can actually use it to take a document and inaccessible PDF, for instance, and it is an electronic tool that will make it somewhat accessible, at least access the text usually, and so forth, without all the formatting that I'm saying is ideal. We implemented Ally on our campus over a year ago. And I had heard horror stories from other campuses that launched it. And I listened very carefully to individuals to find out, well, why not, what was the problem? I wasn't surprised to say, well, faculty this just came out of the blue, and they were they really pushed back on it because they didn't know what accessibility was and whatever. And so knowing that we wanted to launch it, what we did is we just launched it slower than we thought we were going to. The first quarter, we only made the tool for students accessible on Canvas. And so the students got to practice, making documents accessible, and the faculty got used to that, and they go, oh, this is really cool, because what did it do? It didn't require that they do anything. That was the main point. And then we had a pilot of a small group of people, and then we expanded the pilot to several departments and talked about systemic changes in teaching and so forth that can make things more accessible. And so it was about 6 months later that we actually launched it for the whole campus. We had a lot of messaging that went out about it, a lot of training, and a lot of rah, this is really great, and so forth. And actually it was very successful, and we're really happy we did it. It has good analytics too. They can send us data on how accessible our courses are for the whole campus.
Yeah, thank you, Sheryl. We do have a follow-up to that same question. What percentage of faculty are using Blackboard UW?
We don't know of anyone using Blackboard at UW. The UW has standardized on Canvas.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should say Blackboard Ally.
Oh, Terrell Thompson, who works for me, might know. I bet he does. He looks at all the analytics and so forth. So I really don't know. I could find out though. Pass it along.
Excellent, thank you. So another question we have is, do you have any thoughts about UDL and students using different levels of digital literacy, especially in this time when so many learners are 100% remote? And this person has a note saying, as in, students who may not familiar with navigating online environments, using built-in tools for translation, etc.
And so the question is, I don't know what the question is there.
Do you have any thoughts about UDL and students with different levels of digital literacy?
The digital literacy, okay. Yes, so the first one is to at the beginning of the class, maybe in the syllabus or somewhere there, to talk about, as well as other resources, what resources they can access. The biggest mistake I think that online learning instructors make in that regard is sending them to too much information. It's kind of like the 20 tips. We don't send people to our website initially with all the details on how you make these things happen. We show them the 20 tips. And so something similar, as an instructor, I would ask myself first, what do they really need to know? Take that digital literacy and narrow it down to, well, these are the things they absolutely need to know how to do. Otherwise, if someone doesn't have digital literacy, they're not going to get it because it'll be overwhelming. And so then I point them to resources for those various things. The other thing I do is I make digital literacy not a stumbling block to learning the content I'm delivering. I ask myself, do I need to have this tool to teach this concept? And often the answer is no. And so I'm not teaching digital literacy, I am using it. But everything I do, bulletin board and so forth, I make sure is fairly easy to follow. And I tend to keep things pretty simple.
Well, thank you so much, Sheryl. I'm watching the clock, and we are at 10:59. We're almost at an hour. Thanks again. We'll add closed captioning in post-production, and we'll make the recording available. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. You should have my email in the registration notifications. And I also encourage you to look at our summer program if you haven't already. The website is nwelearn.org/conference-2020. And Brennan is copying this link in the chat, so you have that as well. Okay, thank you again, everyone, and have a great summer. And I hope to see you in some of our other sessions. Bye for now.